And then on the fifth Sunday, we get the story of Lazarus, and we find out that he's from Bethany, and he has sisters named Martha and Mary. Now, scholars argue about whether this is the same Martha and Mary that we find in Luke's gospel. Almost certainly, those who read John did not know Luke's gospel. Today, we live in a church where all four gospels are known, but back in the first century and even the first couple decades of the second century, churches that had more than one gospel would have been very lucky, very blessed indeed. So, also, Luke's Martha and Mary, they live in Galilee. Jesus meets them in Galilee, where these live in Bethany in Judea, just a few miles from Jerusalem. But a lot of scholars say, well, it's possible that either Matthew or Luke is confused about where they actually live. And our Catholic teaching about the Bible is not that the Bible has no errors, but that it teaches all the truths that are necessary for our salvation. So whether they lived in Bethany and in Judea or whether they actually lived in Galilee, that our salvation doesn't depend on that. It depends on how well we get to know Jesus Christ. So we're looking at the Gospel of John and Martha and Mary and Lazarus, and Jesus gets the message that the one you love is ill. One of the big mysteries of the Gospel of John is who is the beloved disciples. One theory is that it was John, the son of Zebedee, who wrote the Gospel. For most Catholic scholars, when we honor John, evangelist and apostle, or apostle and evangelist, we're honoring probably four different saints in heaven. The son of Zebedee, the one who was the beloved disciple, someone else from the son of Zebedee, and the evangelist, still a third person who wrote the gospel. And then there's the one we call the final editor who put on chapter 21. And so when we honor John and John, apostle and evangelist, we're actually honoring four different saints in heaven. Anyway, some think that Lazarus, because the only person that it says uses that same verb for love, is the one you love is ill. And so some people think that Lazarus was the beloved disciple. And there are other theories too, but no one knows for sure. So Jesus hears and he says that this illness is going to end for the glory of God. And the glory of God is revealed again in the Passion narrative. For John, the Passion is lifting up. And the process of lifting up for John, it starts with the cross, but it also includes resurrection and ascension. When I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. And John sees all of this as one action. The earliest Christians, they had the Christian Passover, and they celebrated the Passover of Jesus from this life to God. And Holy Saturday night, they celebrated the Passion, the resurrection, and the ascension to heaven, all on one big Holy Night bash. And it was not for several centuries later that finally they started celebrating Holy Thursday as a separate day and Good Friday as a separate day. And the earliest Christians did not distinguish between Holy Saturday night and Easter Sunday morning sunrise service. It was an all-night bash where they read Scripture, baptized people, an all-night thing, which later got broken up into different days. So the Gospel of John worked very well for people who saw this as all one event. passion, death, and resurrection, it's hard for us to see it because we're used to splitting it up in Holy Week onto separate days. But that wasn't the original way to do it. So the disciples, he's going to go down, and it's going to result ultimately in his own death. And the disciples, clueless, Rabbi, the Jews were just trying to stone you. Now, which Jews? Aren't all the apostles Jews? No. In the Gospel of John, the word the Jews does not mean all the Jews. It means a very small group of Jewish leaders. And it's important for us to always remember that. And here again, if one walks during the day, he doesn't stumble, he sees the light. But if one walks at night, he stumbles. And remember at the Last Supper when Judas goes out, and it was night. So our friend Lazarus is asleep. Well, just like the woman at the well misunderstood about living water, so here the disciples misunderstand. And so this gives Jesus a chance to explain, no, he's not really sleeping, but he has died. And Lazarus has died. And then we get, when he goes there, and this is showing that this is a very ancient story. Many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them. In sections of this story, the Jews, who are normally enemies of Jesus and always mean, here the Jews are actually portrayed in a favorable light. What has happened is, after the resurrection, at first the disciples of Jesus got along pretty good with the Pharisees. Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15, talks about Pharisees who are Christians. Paul brags that I am a Pharisee in the Acts of the Apostles. And in the Epistle to the Philippians, he says he was a Pharisee. What happens then is, as the decades go on, the relations between Christians and Pharisees get more and more tense, and then they come to symbolize all Jews. And so then the Jews, after people have, by the end of the first century, they have forgotten when we used to get along pretty good with the Jews. And then 99% of the time it means the enemies of Jesus, but here it has that earlier meaning. The Jews have come to comfort Martha and Mary. And she says, Martha says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know whatever you ask God, he will give you. Now notice, Martha, her view of Jesus is he's like a great prophet. He could even raise the dead, like Elijah and like Elisha. They raised the dead in the Old Testament. I know that whatever you ask God, he will give. But that's not good enough for the Gospel of John. And Jesus says, your brother will rise. And she gives the standard final eschatology. I know he will rise at the resurrection on the last day. And this gives the Johannine Jesus the chance to explain the post-resurrectional truth. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. That's the main point of the story right there. And then he asks her, do you believe this? And she gets to say a line in John's Gospel. The best line in Matthew's Gospel is given to St. Peter. Who do people say that I am? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Matthew's Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, but my heavenly Father. And I say, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. So that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter doesn't get that line in John's gospel. It's given to Martha. Yes, Lord, I have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world. And so then, at this point, Mary gets introduced into the story, and she comes and says the same thing, which is why many scholars think there were originally two versions of the story. One where Mary did the talking, the other when Martha did the talking, and the two have been blended. So, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And there's no response of Jesus here. There's no one necessary because he's already given the response to Martha. He doesn't need to respond to Mary here. And when Jesus sees the weeping, he is deeply troubled. And the question is, why is he deeply troubled? And some think it was sadness because, it says the shortest verse in the Bible, and Jesus wept. It was sadness over the death of his friend, Lazarus. Others think it was sadness over the lack of belief that so many people weren't getting the main point. Biblical scholars argue about that. But Jesus is upset and he weeps, and the Jews say, see how he loved him. Again, that would be an ancient line. There's nothing nasty or mean about that. See how he loved him. And some said, couldn't he opened the eyes of the blind man, couldn't he do something so that this one wouldn't have died? And again, they're thinking maybe he's as good a miracle worker as Elijah or Elijah. And so then we get to the climax where Jesus says, take away the stone. And Martha says, he's been dead for 4 days. There was a legend that the spirit hung around for 3 days, but on the 4th day, the person was really dead. So there will be a stench. And Jesus said, did I not tell you, if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So he has said before, I am the resurrection and the life. Now that is going to be dramatized in action. And he prays and he says, I pray, I know that you always hear, but I'm saying this prayer so that they will believe that you sent me. Again, the blind man had to wash in the pool of Siloam, the one who was sent. Jesus is the one who was sent. The main thing for John is not Bethlehem or Nazareth. Jesus comes from above. He hasn't been sent from his carpenter job to do the Messiah job. He has been sent from heaven. And John is the only gospel that portrays Jesus as being sent from heaven. The Gospel of Mark begins with Jesus being baptized. For Matthew and Luke, the story begins with the conception of Jesus in the womb. So for Matthew and Luke, Jesus begins just like you and I began in the womb of our mother. But the difference is that we began in the womb of our mother with the help of our Father, whereas for Matthew and Luke, the conception of Jesus is miraculous. No human father is involved. But for John, the story does not begin with the womb of the Virgin. It begins, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. The Word became flesh. God sent the Word into the world. And so for John, this sending, when Jesus in Matthew says, I was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, people think, oh, he used to be a carpenter and now God has sent him to preach. But for John, when he says, believe, the world may believe that you sent me, that means sent me from heaven to come to earth to do your will. And after he has said this, he says, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man comes out, and he's tied hand and foot with the burial bonds, and he says, untie him. Now there's going to be another story where someone else is buried, and that person is not going to have to be untied. That's Jesus. And they're going to find the burial clothes in the tomb, but they didn't need to be untied because Jesus' risen body is miraculous. He can come in when the doors are closed. As St. Augustine says, the stone wasn't rolled aside so that Jesus could come out. He was already gone on Easter Sunday morning. The stone was rolled aside so that we could see in. So Lazarus has come back to this life. But the resurrection of Jesus is going to be to a new and greater type of life, a post-resurrectional glorified existence. And then, now many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen what he had done began to believe in him. Notice in this early story, the Jews are presented as believers in Jesus. And this is in John, these are 3 of the 7 signs. I probably can't name the other ones. The marriage at Cana, the healing of the cripple at Bethsaida, the multiplication of the loaves, the walking on the water. Okay, I think I got them all. And then the 3 that we hear here. The other Gospels call these, they're often translated miracles, but the accurate translation is deeds of power. It's dunamis, like English dynamite. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they call these words of Jesus dunamis, they mean they are dynamite, that is, they reveal the power. The word miracle, it literally means astonishment. And when we call something miraculous, we're focusing on our subjective appreciation of what happened, how astonishing it is. So to call it a dunamis, that focuses on the power that was there when it was done. To say miracle, that focuses on our response. John doesn't do either of those. He calls them signs. And they are signs to the mystery of the person of Jesus. In other Gospels, Jesus tells about the Good Shepherd who goes and rescues the sheep. Only in John, I am the Good Shepherd. In other Gospels, Jesus raises the dead. Only in John, I am the resurrection and the life. In other Gospels, Jesus multiplies the bread. Only in John, I am the bread of life. John is always focusing us on the mystery of the person of Jesus. And so that is why the church wants those who are preparing for Easter sacraments to hear these 3 very special Gospels: the woman at the well, the man born blind, and the raising of Lazarus. They are signs that point us to the reality of the mystery of the person of Jesus. So I've had enough fun for one day. I'll call it quits.